Hey everybody, this is Craig Caudill, Director of Nature Blind School. There's all kinds of really cool things that you can see in the outdoors. We're going to be looking at tracks, we're going to be looking at trees, we're going to be looking at how to use a map and compass, and we're going to be looking at a bunch of plants. So follow along with me and Tracker and let's see what we can figure out. In this video, what we're going to be focusing on is trees. Yeah, Tracker knows branches. And he also knows, like I know, and which I hope you know after this video, that trees get broken up into two big types of trees. You have what we have here, which are evergreen type trees, coniferous trees. Those are the ones that have cones on them. And then you have these trees like what are behind me that don't have any leaves on them right now because we're right at the end of winter. These leaves fall off in the fall. That's why we call it fall, the autumn time of the year. What we're going to do is we're going to first take a look at how to identify some of these evergreen trees, some of these pine trees in this particular case. And we're also going to go around and look at a bunch of these types of trees and learn how to identify them using bark, buds, leaves, and where they are in the world. So let's get going. The first thing we need to know about pine trees is that pine trees have real long needles on them. So we're going to get real close on this branch and I'm going to show you some things that are real important to notice. You'll note on the branch of the pine tree that there's groups of needles that come off in different sections. If we look really closely, we'll note that on this particular pine tree that these needles are in groups of two. And you can also notice that these needles are twisted. And if you look from a faraway place, or if you look at these in this particular setting, you can see they're not really dark green, but have sort of a yellow tint to them. This is a Virginia pine tree, what a lot of people sometimes call a yellow pine tree. Let's take a look at this pine cone. We're going to leave it on the branch. But one of the things that you'll note about this particular pine cone on the Virginia pine tree is number one, it's not much bigger than my hand, probably about the same for you. You'll find a lot of pine cones that are longer than your hand. And if you squeeze it a little bit, you'll feel like it's got some little pricklies on it. And they kind of stick to you. They won't hurt you too bad. You don't want to squeeze hard, but you'll feel that's got pricklies to it. And that is another thing that'll tell you that this is a Virginia pine tree. Now let's talk about the bark on this little tree. The bark on a Virginia pine tree is kind of flaky. If you do this lightly, you'll see little pieces that are coming off. That's what we call a flaky tree. Little pieces of it kind of come off. We don't want to do that very much at all because if we take the bark off of a tree, then it's kind of like you getting scarred on your arm or your leg, and it has to heal, and that's hard on trees. So now what I want to do is I want to take you over to a bigger Virginia pine tree and let's see if there's a difference. So this is a big Virginia pine tree. Same thing, you'll notice that some of the bark, just lightly rubbing it, wants to flake off and come off real easy. This is another indicator of a Virginia pine. I also like to think about my pinky finger and how far I can stick it down in the bark. I can just barely stick it down into these valleys of the bark, and it doesn't even cover up my fingernail. That's an indicator of how deep the ridges and the valleys are of the bark, which is another indicator that what we have here is a Virginia pine. Look at the coloration as well. It's got these brown splotches and has this light green stuff that's growing on it. And so we can utilize that as an identifying factor as well. One more thing, we're going to talk about the overall shape, and then we'll know how to find a Virginia pine tree. The other thing that you'll notice about Virginia pine trees is that they often have a cluster of branches when they get older and more mature like this up top, but they don't have very many branches at all down here along the trunk of the tree. So as you get higher into, particularly into a forest, the only branches that you'll find are the ones that are almost near the top. Now this next tree that we're going to look at is very special because even though it loses its leaves, it usually holds on to them throughout the winter. which is very different than most trees out here. This is the American beech. So what we're going to look at here are the leaves, we're going to look at the bark, and we're going to look at the buds and utilize that to help identify this tree. So Tracker has found himself among a bunch of beech trees and a bunch of beech leaves. And what Tracker knows, and I know, and now you know, is that these beech trees that you see in the background, all the trees here that have their leaves on them are beech trees. It's very common for an American beech, which is what we're looking at, to hold its leaves through the whole winter, and then right when spring occurs and the new leaves start to pop out, these leaves will just fall off. Sometimes all the leaves on one tree will fall off in a whole day, very quickly. So let's take a real close look at these leaves. We'll take a look at the bark, and we'll take a look at the buds too. A couple things that really stand out when you're looking at beech leaves is, number one, this vein goes right up the center line, comes all the way to almost to a point. Also, you'll see that there's veins coming off the side, and they alternate all the way down the leaf. So if you'll look, you'll see one here, go to the other side, you'll see one over here, and then you go to the other side over here, and you do that all the way down the leaf. Also, one of the things that really jumps out to me when I'm looking at these leaves is they look like a sawtooth right on the edge of the leaves themselves, almost as if we could utilize this as a saw to cut something. And this helps me identify this as an American beech. Have you ever been in the woods and you see a tree, it looks like it's got a bunch of eyes looking back, like this right here? This is another thing that really makes the American beech stand out. Looks like it has a bunch of eyes. This is actually where a branch was, and it eventually died and broke off, and then it healed itself over, but it looks like it's that shape. The other thing about American beech is that the bark is really tight, meaning it feels really strongly tight to the tree itself. There's no valleys here, there's no furrows, there's anything of that nature that we can help to identify. And what makes this really stand out is it's slick and very tight to the tree. Now let's take a look at the buds. Now the buds on the American beech, when you look at them, they almost look like little thorns, but they're not. Buds are actually the leaves that are getting ready to come out in the springtime. And so you'll see those all the way along the branch of any tree that loses its leaves. These actually come out around midsummer. People think that these come out in the spring. They don't. They've been there since the summertime, just waiting for the spring to happen and from them to explode and pump and become big green leaves. But when you see it, it looks like it's going to hurt you, but they don't. These are alternating, just like the veins were on the leaf itself, alternating down the stem, and they look like tiny thorns. That is another sign of the American beech. Let's go find another tree. Now what we have here is the Kentucky state tree, which is the tulip poplar. A lot of people call this yellow poplar, and it looks a lot like the beech tree that we were just looking at. But there are some things for sure that we can look and determine this is a poplar tree. Let's take a look. If you look real closely to the bark of a poplar tree, you'll see what looks like a bunch of little tiny holes. Like somebody has come by here and took a nail and done something like this. That is not what somebody has done. This is very natural. This actually helps the poplar tree get the nourishment that it needs. And you'll see these oftentimes in a line running up and down the tree like you see right here. This is a real good example. You don't see that on the beech tree. See all these little dots up and down the tree? The other thing that I really like about poplar trees is the bud. So let's go take a look at the bud on the poplar tree because it's very unique, and see how we can utilize it to identify our state tree. Quack, 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 quack. Yeah, this is the tulip poplar tree. And I'm quacking like a duck because the bud on a tulip poplar tree, which is what we see right here, looks like the duck bill. Imagine the bill of a duck, quack, 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 quack. It kind of looks like that right at the end. And when you have multiple versions of it down the stem, you'll see that they all kind of look like a duck bill. Typically, the one that's at the end, which is what we call the terminal bud, is going to be bigger than the buds that are along the branch. I like to look for this terminal bud when I'm looking for a poplar tree. Now what we are looking at here are the green leaves of the tulip poplar tree. You'll notice that the outline of the leaf itself kind of looks like a tulip flower. That's why it's called tulip poplar. It's very unique. It has something that sort of looks like a mitten, almost like a hand, with 2 fingers sticking out the side and 2 short ones up top. But it looks like the outline of a flower. This is the leaf of the tulip poplar. The interesting thing about a poplar tree is that when it gets older, the bark looks very different. On the young poplar tree, the bark is really tight, but as it gets older, it starts to develop these ridges and furrows and valleys. I can stick my pinky finger almost all the way down in there, and that will get even bigger as this tree gets larger and larger. One of the things that I also notice about the poplar tree, if you'll look, you'll see that it has this growth on it. A lot of people think that's moss. That's actually a lichen. And this is really something that happens very often on poplar trees. And so when you're looking for a poplar tree, you'll find this growing on it very often and can easily identify it. Now let's go find a couple of my most favorite trees in the whole wide world, the white oak and a red oak. This is one of my most favorite trees in the whole wide world because it's pretty. It's got all kinds of cool stuff, and wildlife really like it because it has acorns and food on it that squirrels eat, turkeys eat, grouse eat, deer eat, so they love this tree. This is the white oak. Let's take a look at some of the identifying features of it. If you look into a forest, a lot of trees are dark and some of them are lighter, and this tree is one of those that is a lot lighter colored than others. I'm not sure if that's why it has the name white oak, but it is in essence the white oak. It has a light coloration compared to the other trees that you'll find typically around it. I call this somewhat flaky bark, and that you can see parts of it are popping off, but as I rub my hand around on it, it does not just fall off. It's still pretty strongly tight to the tree, but you can see these deep gaps that are inside here, which are great places for bugs to hide. That's why you'll see woodpeckers land on this tree and get into the bark and get the bugs. Any number of different things, including bats, sometimes will get under the folds of this bark and make homes. Bats are really good for the environment because they eat a lot of mosquitoes. Tree like this that has some of the bark standing off of it will be a good home for them. Now, let's take a look at the leaves, and we'll also take a look at the buds. In the wintertime, the leaves that fall off are going to be brown and decaying and breaking apart, so it's difficult to see a lot of the identifying features, but you'll notice on white oaks that around the edge of the leaf itself is rounded. This is a really good indicator of white oaks. In the summertime, the leaves look like this. Same thing, rounded edges and lobes, but they're more easily seen in this particular shot here. One of the things that jumps out as far as the buds are concerned is that you'll have a cluster right at the end of a branch. That's what we call the oak cluster. And so you'll see different pieces and parts, which will actually be leaves. These have already fallen off. You'll start to see some of the green spots in there. That's where a leaf is getting ready to bud out and come out probably within the next 2 weeks. Now let's go find a red oak. Now this is a red oak, and you'll note really quick like, red oaks are typically darker than white oak species. I find that the bark is a lot tighter, and on some species, these kind of look like ski slopes. You can see these ridges on the bark coming down the tree. You can imagine somebody skiing down through there if they were coming down through there skiing down the tree. So let's find some leaves and we'll find some buds and take it from there. Now, you'll often see clusters of oak leaves like this that have come off a tree. What's happened here is something has chewed this off of the tree and bit it off and it came down. But on red oaks, what you'll note is that the edges of the leaves are pointed. Remember on the white oaks they were rounded, but on the red oaks these are pointed. The buds, similar to the white oak, are very similar, and you can see these a lot easier than before. You'll see the clusters of the buds right here at the end of the terminal portion of the branch. If you look real close, you'll see if this branch had lived and stayed on the tree, this leaf was going to fall off. This was going to be the new bud that comes out and turns into a leaf this coming year. Last but not least, when it comes to identifying oak trees have the fruit of them, which is called an acorn. It has a cute cap on it, looks like a little hat, and these are identifying fruits of an oak tree. Now I'm going to show you two more trees that you can identify rather quickly just by looking at the bark. This is a shagbark hickory. You'll note that these pieces of the bark are real thick and they look like they're falling off, like maybe this tree is a little sick. It's not sick at all. This is exactly what shagbark hickories do. And so it's real easy to see the bark standing off like this and know, hey, I'm looking at a shagbark hickory. I love me some frosted flakes. Do you? I think the bark of a dogwood tree kind of looks like Frosted Flakes cereal. Some people say it looks like gravel. What's it look like to you? Whatever it looks like to you, remember it, because this is one of the most beautiful flowers that's going to come out in the springtime. It's a tree, but it has beautiful flowers that come out in the spring that are white and gorgeous. I hope you've enjoyed this walk through the woods, enjoying some trees. If you have any questions, make sure you ask your teacher, and I'll be happy to help them whenever I can. Come on, join in. Let's learn together.